I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest? Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters, those of you who have questions about the Catholic faith. Maybe you've been thinking about this one thing about the Catholic faith for maybe 10, 15, 20 years. My goodness. Let's get those questions answered right here and right now. Here is our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, you'll want to dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And for those of you watching on TV today, you can participate as well. Our email address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Glad to have him behind the board. We also have Ryan Penny as our phone screener today, and Jeff Burson is on social media. If you want to pose a question via YouTube or Facebook, he will pass those on to us here in the studio. And we are streaming right now. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing all right, thanks.
Glad to hear that. We're going to lead off with a question here. This is a text that we received from Peggy. Regarding the gospel reading about the parable of the weeds in the field, I have Presbyterian friends, she says, who use this parable to, quote, prove double predestination. The weeds are the seed of Satan, or so they say. How do you respond?
Well, thanks. So Sacred Scripture tells us that we are moved in our redemption from the kingdom of Satan to the kingdom of God's beloved Son. That's a biblical teaching. And Christ said in John chapter 8 to those who had rejected his ministry, your father is the devil. It's pretty forthright, you know. And the book of Ephesians talks about those in the minds of whom the prince of the spirits of the air, that would be the devil, is at work. And St. Paul in, Acts 26, says in front of, my mind just went blank on the king's name. Anyway, Paul says in front of the king that the Lord said to him that he had called him to turn the Gentiles from Satan to God. So it is a fact that we're in one of two camps, right? We're either serving God, or if we're not serving God, we're serving the ends of the devil. Now, it's also true that God knows who's in what camp today, and he knows who is going to be in which camp at the end. So there is a number of the elect. The elect are those people who are going to be saved, those people whom God foreknows will be saved, and those who will not.
Okay.
But the point of the parable is you leave it to God to sort out.
Yes.
You leave it to God to sort out. Now, one of the distinctives of the Calvinist doctrine of double predestination, as it emerged in the 16th century in the Presbyterian tradition, was they thought they knew who was in what camp. Right? And for them it was extremely important that an individual know with certainty that they were in the camp of the elect, and that having been placed there, they wouldn't get out of that camp. And by consequence, they could know who wasn't in that camp. Well, the Catholics don't see it that way, right? We leave the sorting out of the weeds and the tares to Christ and his judgment at the end of time. And in the meanwhile, I need to keep on persevering and do everything I can to make sure I'm in the right camp.
Sure. Sounds good. And we thank you so much for your text. Let's go now to one from an anonymous listener. While I was Catholic, I was never confirmed. Do I have to wait for my husband's annulment and my marriage to be validated in order to be confirmed? Again, that's from an anonymous texter.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to let you take this up with your pastor, and you present the case to him, because I don't know all the details of your case. Now, we ought to be properly disposed to worthily receive the sacrament of confirmation, or any sacrament, and that would presume that we're not knowingly in the state of mortal sin, and we'd like to not be in that condition so we can worthily receive the sacrament. And but I'm not gonna. I don't know the details of your situation, so I'm gonna let you discuss that with your pastor.
Very good. And here's a question we received from Luke, checking us out on YouTube. In 2 minutes, David, what is the history of confession?
Oh, thanks. So the practice of making verbal confession of sin has always been a part of the Christian tradition. St. James writes about it in chapter 5 of his epistle. He says, "Confess your sins to one another so that you can be healed." And in the 2nd century, the pagan critic of Christianity, Celsus, Church Father Origen wrote a treatise against Celsus, mocked Christians and said they were like frogs sitting around a pond croaking to each other and confessing their sinfulness, right? So from the point of view of an outsider, one of the characteristic behaviors of Christians was to make public confession of their sin. Now, Christ also gave to the church the power to absolve sin, to forgive sin. It said in John 20 to the apostles, "Whoever sins you forgive are forgiven." And it was not always the case that the church exercised that power of absolution or forgiveness in the context of the private confessional. That was an innovation of the Middle Ages. Previously, the discipline of public confession of sin may or may not have been attached to the gift of absolution, but as a spiritual discipline, it's always been a part of the church. And so you even find in the Middle Ages the practice of the pious confession of sins from layman to layman, without any expectation of sacramental absolution, but just as a pious practice, an act of humility. If memory serves me correct, I believe St. Ignatius of Loyola, when he was still a soldier, prior to the siege of that battle where he nearly got his leg blown off, had made confession to another soldier. It was not an uncommon practice at the time. And what the church did, also you make confession to a spiritual director and this sort of thing. Church said, let's take this pious practice of verbal confession, let's connect that to the power we have always had of forgiving sins, which is usually exercised in a public way. Let's bring those together and make the confessional a private occasion for not only for absolution of sin, but spiritual direction and the like. And what a great innovation that was, a gift of the Fourth Lateran Council to the Universal Church.
And thank you so much for checking us out on YouTube, Luke. We do appreciate that. Phone lines are open, 833-288-EWTN.
If you're currently an EWTN media missionary or just interested in becoming one, we've got some great news. EWTN Media Missionaries has a new and improved website, EWTNmissionaries.com, designed with you in mind. Our new site is loaded with great features and it's easy to navigate. There are so many different ways that you can help EWTN. Join us in sharing the eternal word with the world. Visit EWTNmissionaries.com today.
Bishop Robert Barron. I'm kind of a teacher by nature, and I've always loved books and ideas and life of the mind and speaking and all that. So I brought that into the priesthood. A very wise thing was said a long time ago, namely that if God chose you to be a priest, He chose you to be a priest, meaning He chose you with your particular gifts and what you're going to bring. So you don't leave that behind. On the contrary, God chose me with these particular gifts. So I've always discerned that teaching and writing and preaching and proclaiming would be a key part of it. And it has been. I found great joy in that. I've always found joy in the pastoral work. I did it when I was newly ordained. I was in a parish for 4 years. And whenever I would go to a hospital, I go to a nursing home, go into the school, counsel, engage couples. I always found great joy in that, even though it's challenging.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
It's called a communion here on EWTN, and our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 288-3986. Chuck is checking us out on Facebook today. Chuck says, I've been listening to your podcasts, and I really appreciate how you have cleared up some misconceptions that I've had about the Catholic Church. Now, regarding the issue of abstinence versus birth control, if a married couple uses the, quote, rhythm method in order to have marital relations without the prospect of pregnancy, how is that different from using other methods since the intent is the same, sex without babies?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So actually there's depends on what you mean by the rhythm method. Today we usually talk about natural family planning, which is more scientific and reliable than the old-fashioned rhythm method. You know, there's a joke about what do you call people who use the rhythm method? Parents.
Hey-o.
But but natural family planning is a way of discerning when fertility is most probable in
and as you say, it's a lot more sophisticated.
Yeah, and it can be very accurate if you do it properly, follow the instructions. The success rate is better than artificial methods of family planning. So it's very effective. But anyway, the root of the thing is not having sex. Except sometimes. So you say, well, what's the difference between trying to prevent pregnancy while having sex and trying to prevent pregnancy by not having sex? Well, I don't know about you, Tom, but in my book, like between having sex and not having sex, there's a pretty big difference. There's a pretty big difference. Because in the second one, the not having sex business, it requires you to actually be abstinent. So it is a tremendous lifestyle difference. The difference in lifestyle is enormous, and it brings about a difference in the way spouses regard one another and their own bodies, and the nature and purpose of their marital sexuality. And one maintains a consciousness of being intrinsically open to the possibility of new life. And if you're categorically not open to new life right now, today, because for whatever medical, financial, what it can't go there, well, you're not having conjugal relations, at least not with any kind of frequency. That's a very different kind of lifestyle.
Indeed. Okay. Chuck, thank you for checking us out on Facebook. And if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Ruth in Green, Iowa, checking us out today via Roku. Hey there, Ruth. What's on your mind today?
Well, I have conversations with my sister a lot, and she's a person that doesn't go to any church, but she reads the Bible, and that is it, okay? And she believes that our church prevented the printing of the Bible, and that we really didn't want anyone reading it for themselves to know what the truth was. And I never know what to answer her.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So the history of the faithful and their engagement with the Bible is a very long one. And, of course, the Bible has been part of the church's liturgy from the moment that the biblical texts were composed. It's always been part of the sacred liturgy. The Old Testament, of course, before the New Testament was written, the apostles and the early Christians were reading the Old Testament scriptures in sacred worship and handing them on. And then as the apostles composed their memoirs and epistles, they would be added to the cycle of liturgical readings. And it's been there from the very beginning. In fact, one of the criterion that the Catholic Church used to determine whether a New Testament text should be regarded as canonical was, is it being used in the public worship of the churches, especially those churches that were founded by apostles? So ecclesiastical use, yes. Use by the Catholic Church in sacred worship was one of the principal criterion for determining canonicity. So it's always been there as part of the life of the church. The prayer of the church, the daily prayer of the Catholic Church, has always been the Psalter, the Psalms of the Old Testament, the Psalms of David. And what we now know of as the breviary or the divine office grew out of the practice of the faithful gathering with their bishop to pray the Psalms on a daily basis. And if you read the lives of the Desert Fathers, early monastics, kind of the founders of monasticism, these were generally laymen, lay women, who went to the desert to live ascetical lives of self-denial and prayer, and their prayer was shaped by the Psalter. Many of them, if not most of them, were illiterate. Think about Anthony of the desert, Anthony the Great, an illiterate person, and yet they had the whole Psalter memorized. Well, how do you think they got that? How do you think they memorized 150 Psalms when they were illiterate people? It's because they were so accustomed to hearing them prayed in the churches.
Sure.
It's always been a part of the church's life. And as the church spread specifically into Western Europe, Bible translation followed a pace. And so we have, we've got the manuscripts. We have the record of the Bible being translated into Saxon, into Celtic languages, into various Northern European languages. All as the church is expanding into these domains, so is the language of sacred scripture being translated. Now, there was a deep consciousness on the part of the Gothic and Celtic tribes of the necessity of being in union with the Church of Rome, and it was a popular groundswell of interest. It wasn't just something that was imposed. There was a desire to be faithful to liturgical practice as it was celebrated in the First See, right, the Pope's diocese, and so people wanted to have the liturgy and the scriptures in Latin because that was the Pope's language. And, of course, it was also the language of learning and culture, and so it was kind of a prestige that attached to it. And over time, as Latin ceased to be really the lingua franca of the people of Western Europe and these converts, naturally they became, and this was an organic development. It wasn't something that was imposed by the church. It just happened as the result of demographics, to be made more and more remote from the language of liturgy. Did that mean that the faithful were unfamiliar with the content of the Bible? Well, the way to test that hypothesis is to go read the lives of the saints in the High and later Middle Ages. So after this process of linguistic and demographic change had been underway for some centuries, go read the lives of these folks and see how they related to sacred scripture. I can think of no better example than the life of St. Francis of Assisi, who was a layman at the time of his conversion and entry into his particular form of religious life. Only later was he ordained to the diaconate. And one of the things characteristic of Francis's spirituality was a deep veneration and knowledge of the sacred text. And the early Franciscans who were laymen, right? They weren't priests.
Yes.
Had the recitation and the prayer of the office and of the scriptures as a regular part of their rule, and they made it part of their preaching and their ministry to the wider world. As soon as printing was invented, and the Bible was printed in vernacular languages and in the Vulgate translation as well, religious printing in general took off. It became the dominant genre of literature that was printed throughout the world. And so that would be Bibles and passages of Bible texts, but also other catechetical literature. And so there was widespread dissemination of religious and biblical information across Europe after the invention of printing. Now, is there any evidence for the thesis that the church ever tried to actively dissuade people from reading the Bible? So there were movements beginning in the 12th, 13th, 14th century that were anti-hierarchical, anti-clerical. They were iconoclastic. They were even revolutionary and subversive politically. That emerged in Bohemia, in England, that sometimes had pretty radical ideas. Just think about southern France and the Albigensians. And they had crazy ideas about practicing suicide and forbidding marriage and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. Or the Wycliffites in England that said that if you're in the state of mortal sin, you lose not only religious but even political jurisdiction. Imagine if you try to run a country on the idea that I get to judge whether or not you're a legitimate ruler on the basis of my sense of whether or not you're in the state of grace.
Whoa.
And that's a very politically revolutionary idea.
Yeah.
So some of these dangerous movements emerge, and the church is like, well, how do you deal with this? What's the best way in policy to cope with this kind of revolutionary language that's destabilizing to the culture and to society? And look, this is not these issues were of great moment. I mean, the Albigensians in southern France were torturing and killing Catholics. They're putting them to death. I mean, in horrific ways. This is bad stuff. How do we deal with that? And they're thinking, well, should we write or print a whole bunch of Bibles and just dump them on the heretics and run away? Will that solve the problem? No, because, just dumping a Bible on somebody is not going to make them an Orthodox believer or even a good Christian necessarily, because that's not the Bible's purpose, wasn't why it was written, not how God intends it to be used, the Lutheran position notwithstanding. And so you do find some Catholic reformers in the late Middle Ages, in the 15th century, for example, saying, we really need to promote catechetical ministry with the faithful and knowledge of Christ and the Gospels and all the rest of it. But there's an open debate about whether the best way to do that is like to print a bunch of Bibles and dump them on people that are already running off with crazy ideas. So that's a moment in the Church's history. That's a particular moment in the Church's history. But all of the kind of, if I can say so, the bad press about the Catholic relationship to the Bible comes out of this one tiny little particular moment. And of course, that was never the dominant point of view in Catholic history, and it isn't today, and it wasn't even after the Reformation. Because what did the Church do after the Reformation? Turns around, translates the Bible again into, among other languages, English.
Absolutely.
So the Douay Rheims is an ecclesiastically approved translation for use by the laity.
So how much of a window of time are we talking about here where that was going on?
Well, the rise in these kind of subversive revolutionary movements starts in a small way, probably in the 11th or 12th centuries. And so, you've got maybe a period of a century or two, where there's a lively debate among Catholic leaders about what is the best way to handle, politically and ecclesiastically subversive and revolutionary movements in their relationship to sacred Scripture. Okay. How should we handle that?
Yeah.
But, by the time of the invention of printing kind of solved that problem in the sense that, like, it ceases to really become a live option. I mean, because the books are there.
Sure.
There they are. They're in circulation.
Yes.
You got to deal with them.
Okay, very good. Ruth, we hope that is helpful for you. Thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now, and that number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. What's keeping you from becoming a Catholic? We would love to know here on EWTN Radio's Call to Communion. We got a call from Kevin in St. Louis listening on Covenant Radio. He really wanted to stay but could not. Circumstances bid that he had to get off the phone. But he did leave us his question. Did Constantine outlaw worship on Saturday?
Okay, thanks. So Catholics have been worshiping God on Saturday and Sunday, and Monday, and Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday.
And Friday.
And Friday, right.
Thank you.
From the beginning. Like, there's no day of the week when we fail to worship God. Sunday has been a particular holy day in the Church's calendar from the apostolic age. And we read in the book of Acts, even, in the New Testament, about the believers gathering on the first day of the week to commemorate the Lord's resurrection. So that's the particular hallowing of Sunday as a feast has been part of the Christian tradition from the beginning. And it's especially important to celebrate the holy sacrifice of the Mass on that day. But the Church has never said you can't worship God on any other day. Now, there was a strong emphasis on saying, but we don't worship as the Jews worship. So we're not going to keep a seventh-day Sabbath like the Jews.
I see.
Because the Mosaic law is no longer in force for the Gentile church. But that's very different from saying, I forbid you from worshiping on Saturday.
Sure is. Kevin, thank you so much for your call. Sorry we couldn't get to you live on the phone there, but we did what we could and we got your question answered. Thank you so much for your call. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. Let's go to Joe now in Quincy, Illinois, listening on Covenant Radio. Joe is a first-time caller. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind today?
Hey, guys. Just to clarify, I was listening to you talk to the previous caller about natural family planning, and I was, or maybe it was a text, this question sent in, I can't remember. But you had said, well, I guess to clarify, I was under the impression that with birth control, you're actually preventing God from giving you the gift of a child if that's His will. However, with natural family planning, you're still open to that will, to God's will, and not preventing it. Is that correct, or am I wrong?
Sure, absolutely. Now, there are situations where a married couple may, for a season, think that it is not prudent to conceive a child. And so the purpose of allowing natural family planning, I mean, there's some people who just say, look, we're just going to not pay attention to fertility at all, and we're just we're just going to toss the coin every day, and we'll take as many babies as God will give us. And that's, if you can do that, that's fine, right? That's certainly a very Catholic attitude. But the Church says, look, we understand there could be human reasons. Well, let's say the health of the mother is grievously endangered, for example, when it's legitimate to say we just can't conceive, and there's a morally permissible way of doing that.
Okay, very good. And Joe, we hope that clarifies it for you. In a moment, we'll have more phone calls for you, and there's a line open right now, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986.
Father John Riccardo.
When you and I wake up every day, do we strive to know Jesus or not? Quick question to you and me right now. Is that what you and I are doing every single day?
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
And this is an EWTN bookmark brief. I'm Doug Keck. I just had the pleasure of speaking with Father Timothy Gallagher, OMV, about his book, A Layman's Guide to the Liturgy of the Hours, How the Prayers of the Church Can Change Your Life. So let's give people an overview of what this book's about and why they should pick it up.
So the book asks, is this prayer of the Liturgy of the Hours, this return to praying the Psalms at various times throughout the day, is this something just for priests or is it something for lay people? We ask a concrete question, are lay people praying it? And the answer is increasingly yes. Mm-hmm. We look then specifically at each of these different times of prayer. The word hour doesn't mean 60 minutes in this case, it means the time of day. Mm-hmm. And the Church invites the lay people to consider praying one, two, or some of these. And then we look at practically how do you get started.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Father. Timothy Gallagher, author of A Layman's Guide to the Liturgy of the Hours. And this has been an EWTN bookmark brief. I'm Doug Keck. Thanks for stopping by.
This is what St. Teresa of Calcutta, also known as Mother Teresa, once said about prayer. Love to pray. Feel often during the day the need for prayer and take trouble to pray. Prayer enlarges the heart until it is capable of containing God's gift of Himself. Ask and seek, and your heart will grow big enough to receive Him and keep Him as your own. That is why we need prayer.
Hi, this is Janet Williams. You don't have to be a woman to enjoy Women of Grace tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern here on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's EWTN's Call to Communion here on this beautiful day. We have a couple of lines open for you if you have a question for Dr. David Anders or if you'd like to explain why you are not a Catholic. I'd love to hear about that. 833-288-EWTN is our number, 833-288-3986. Back to the phones now for Katie in Atlanta, listening to us today via YouTube. Hello, Katie. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, hey, guys. Really excited to be here. Thanks for taking my call. So I'm kind of switching gears a little bit because I was listening in for a little bit, and it's, awesome what we have. But I am going to ask a really difficult question, and it's about gay rights. Because being, a young person, and I mean, obviously I have friends that are gay, and they want to have a gay marriage. And of course, we know the Church's stance on gay marriage, that we don't endorse it. And, we won't have a gay marriage. It's just not what we do. And so how do we respond when somebody says that they are gay?
Okay, thanks.
I've had several. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So let me make a distinction, if I could. There's the truth of our sexuality that the Church teaches, and we need to know that and be familiar with it. And then there's the pastoral question of how we present that truth to someone who may not be open to hearing it. And so, the first thing to do with your gay friend is to love them.
Yes.
Take them to lunch. Be present to them, accompany them, be a friend to them, care for them, listen to them, be present to them, be as Christ to them. That's the first thing you do with a gay person, as you would do with any human being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Recognize their intrinsic dignity and their humanity and love them and seek their good and well-being. But what is the good and well-being of a gay person or a straight person or of any person? Well, it's that we be united to God in charity. And charity, uniting us to God, is not a sentiment. It's not just happy little feelings about God, but it has teeth in it, right? It has real teeth. And Jesus describes that charity in the Sermon on the Mount when he speaks in the Beatitudes. One of those Beatitudes is purity of heart, right? And he talks about the kind of radical self-donation, the kind of radical giving that is called for in our sexuality. Twice in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, you can't divorce your wife for any reason whatsoever at all.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be faithful, right? Because God is faithful to you. And even if maybe you're not very happy in your marriage, Jesus says, not the issue, not the issue. Marriage is a sacrament of service, is there to bring the other person to God and to replenish society with little new people. It has a function, it has a purpose that's bigger than you and bigger than your happiness and bigger than your sexuality. It's there to be a gift to the culture, replenish society with new people, and to the church as we bring people to God, right? So that means that I have to sacrifice my own will, maybe my own pleasure, to this greater and more transcendent good. And that single-minded commitment to the love of God, to what's right in the eyes of God, and to the good of my neighbor in that more robust sense,
mm-hmm.
That's what Scripture calls purity of heart, without which no one will see God. And so that kind of life requires sacrifices, whether you're gay or straight. So let's say you're a straight guy, and you're getting on up there in age, and maybe it's not as exciting at home as it used to be, and some pretty young thing around the office is starting to act kind of flirty, and you think you might want to go that way. Sorry, not an option. You've got to be chaste. You have to make a sacrifice of your sexuality. Well, my sexuality inclines me to go this way. In the case of the straight guy, maybe it's chasing the secretary. Sorry, you have to say no to your sexuality. You have to make a gift of yourself. You have to be committed to something bigger than yourself. The welfare of your wife, the welfare of your children, the welfare of your culture, your society. You're going to bring new kids into the world through marriage. You're going to raise them up to be good citizens, to be virtuous people, who love truth and justice. That's what that's what your sexuality is for. It's not just to serve yourself. That's a struggle. That's a sacrifice that a straight guy has to make. Gay guy might have to make a similar sacrifice. All right, see, so the challenge of chastity, right, that it's not just about me or my pleasure, that's not something that only gay people face. That's something we all face. And it's difficult. It's difficult. But with grace, all things are possible. Let me back up a little bit and talk about why there is an institution called marriage, and then get into this issue of rights. Why is there such a thing called marriage? Why have marriage? Well, not just in the Catholic Church, but anywhere, in any culture, any society, any civilization, why is there this thing called marriage? Well, if you look through the history of human civilization, Christian, non-Christian, Catholic, non-Catholic, doesn't matter, you find that marriage exists as an institution for the blindingly obvious reason that when men and women get together in intimate union, babies tend to happen. And they come into the world needy, and they need to be protected and reared, raised up, taught the virtues, initiated into public life. And there are people who are sort of ready-made to do that job. They're called parents. And there is something unique in the parent-child relationship and in the relationship between the persons who brought those kids into the world. Two tennis players, however wonderful their union over the game of tennis, are not going to bring a new child into the world in virtue of playing tennis. Tennis is a great game, but society does not have a vested interest in hallowing or sacralizing a tennis partnership as the foundation of culture. Because tennis does not replenish the world with new tennis players. But the male-female procreative union does. There's something unique about sexual relations between a man and a woman, namely that it is intrinsically procreative. It brings new life into the world. And it's that specific fact that requires an institution like marriage, so that there is a resource, an institution there to provide for the care and nurture of those new people. And our very biology orients us towards this commitment. You know, modern scientists have discovered that there is a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin kicks in and makes you want to bond with people. And you're never going to find a higher blast of oxytocin than when a woman gives birth to a child.
Better believe it.
Right? It also emerges, believe it or not, in the sexual union between a man and a woman. Why would God make nature that way? Seems pretty obvious. Nature has an interest in mothers and fathers bonding to one another and to the children that they bring into the world. And the social institution of marriage is just a recognition of something that is true of our biology, you see.
Yeah.
And so where do rights come from? Well, right is a fancy way of saying that society owes me something, right? Because there is some good to be realized. And, my life is a good to be realized. The use of my reason is a good to be realized. The use of my procreative faculties is a great good to be realized with the benefit to the wider culture. And so we recognize it is reasonable that we protect these inherently good powers in the human person and facilitate and enable their operation because they bring about these great social goods like life and education and offspring. And that's where rights flow from.
Mm-hmm.
But something interesting happened, something very dangerous happened in the modern world, both with respect to marriage and with respect to rights. With respect to marriage, a new idea emerged in the 19th century, and it was this. The idea was that marriage ought to be romantic, it ought to be emotional, I ought to have this great passionate, love affair with my spouse, and that's the purpose of marriage. Marriage exists so I can have deep ushy-cushies.
Cue the string section.
Yes, and look, ushy-cushies are fine, but they exist because they facilitate that bond that then brings these new kids into the world. They don't exist for their own sake.
Right.
That's the ideology of romanticism, like that they're an end in themselves. As soon as the ideology of romanticism took over marriage, guess what happened? Divorce rate shoots up.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because ushy-cushies fade. What bonds people together are not the ushy-cushies. It's the common commitment to an institution that is bigger than themselves, right? And that dedication to service, to the public good. But people forgot why there was an institution called marriage, and thinking that it was just about ushy-cushies, and that the institution was there just to sacralize and hallow and go, yay, ushy-cushies, then all of a sudden anything that gives ushy-cushies should be called marriage. So, if you have a real strong attachment to your sock drawer, then you should be able to, quote unquote, marry your sock drawer, like the fellow who married the Eiffel Tower a few years back, right? But there's no transcendent good that's being served by my attachment to my sock drawer or to the Eiffel Tower or to my tennis partner in the same way that this transcendent good is being served by my commitment to my natural spouse with whom I can bear children. Society doesn't have an interest in hallowing that in quite the same way. There's no reason. It's not reasonable to assign a right to something that is just this kind of arbitrary feeling to which no natural good is attached. Now, in the case of homosexual relations, it is an attachment, yes, to persons, right, and to a certain kind of sexual union that is intrinsically infertile. It's intrinsically infertile. Children don't emerge from homosexual union. and therefore it's not equivalent morally to the sexual union of men and women that is naturally procreative. And there are all kinds of ways to respect the dignity and the persons of homosexuals without drawing an equivalence between homosexual sex and the naturally procreative sex of men and women. And so there just is no natural right to gay marriage.
Okay. And there it is. Katie, thank you so much for your call. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. We'll try to get to as many calls as we can today. Right now, I want to tell you about a brand new book from EWTN Publishing. We have it right here with us on set. The Decalogue Decoded, What You Never Learned About the Ten Commandments, with our friend Father Brian Mulady. Father Brian has written a remarkable book that reveals the often overlooked soul-nourishing elements and implications of each of the Ten Commandments. If you read this book, you're going to love it. You will come to understand how the commandments are not just 10 individual rules, or as you often hear these days, the 10 suggestions. These are an entire plan of life that draws you ever more into God and brings you enduring peace with others and with yourself. Do check it out, The Decalogue Decoded, What You Never Learned About the Ten Commandments. It is new from EWTN Publishing, and it's available right now at EWTNRC.com. EWTNRC.com. Let's go back to the phones now and talk with Susan in Buffalo, New York, listening on Sirius XM 130. She is a first-time caller. Hey, Susan, what's on your mind today?
Hi. A non-Catholic friend asked me if I would ever be interested in participating in a manuscript Bible study, and I'm wondering if you've ever heard of that.
Okay, thanks. So I know what manuscripts are, and I know what Bibles are, and I know what study is. So I don't exactly know what your friend is getting at, but it might be this. The Bible exists in thousands of different manuscripts from the ancient world. And you know, it's the best preserved ancient text that we have. There are just gazillions of copies of the thing, complete copies and partial copies in Greek and early translations into Syriac and Aramaic and Hebrew, just scattered all over the place. All of those manuscripts, those papyri, don't all agree in every aspect. So little minor differences, a passage left out here, a little word changed over there, and we find that they tend to fall into clumps. So manuscript traditions, they're called, from Alexandria, which is one of the major manuscript families, differ slightly from manuscripts that you would find coming out of Byzantium. That's another major manuscript family.
Okay.
And so modern biblical scholars will compare these manuscript traditions, and then the science of lower textual criticism tries to make these comparisons and decide which differences are probably closest to what the apostles actually wrote. And so most of the Bibles that you will pick up today, if you go to the store and buy a Bible off the shelf, the translation is based not on a single manuscript, but on a blending and composition of manuscripts from across the ancient world that have been subjected to this kind of critical reading to try to figure out what's the best original text. The differences in meaning are very slight, and there is no dogma of the Catholic faith that hangs on the judgment of biblical scholars. And it's important for Catholics to know that God did not give us the Bible to preserve the faith. He gave us the church to preserve the faith, and the Bible is a witness to the faith that the church proclaims. So our faith is not in any way endangered by the science of biblical textual criticism. Now, all I can imagine that your friend means, and I have no idea, all I can imagine is that perhaps she is interested in a study that would compare manuscript traditions and get into kind of a critical analysis of biblical manuscripts and how one may differ from another. Is that something you want to do? Well, it's a pretty scholarly endeavor if that's what she has in mind.
Yeah.
I would say the benefits of that would be very remote from the spiritual concerns of the average person. the only people that would really be interested in that kind of thing would be biblical scholars and then maybe Catholic apologists, right? But for the average layperson, I don't see a lot of utility in that. If you get into a Bible study or maybe hear a sermon or a lecture someplace where someone starts making wild claims about the Catholic faith or about the Christian religion and saying, well, what the Greek really says is, and then you find out that, Jesus is a burrito from the far side of Saturn, almost always those are really idiosyncratic interpretations by people that scientifically and technically we would call nut jobs. All right. And I've got no use for that kind of thing.
Okay. And Susan, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Tim now in Seattle listening. Not quite sure where he's listening, but he is a first-time listener. We're glad to have him. Hello, Tim. What's on your mind today?
Well, you were asking why people did not want to become Catholics.
Sure.
And I was born and raised in the Catholic religion until about 12 years old, when my mother was excommunicated from the church because she divorced my father, who was abusive to her. So that's probably why I am not going to be Catholic. And also, I've been around many Catholics. Just recently, my wife's brother passed away, and he was Catholic, and really began to question his faith over regards to all the abuses that are coming to light that have been protected by the Catholic Church. And I myself was an altar boy and had friends that were abused by the priest of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
Tim, I really appreciate these comments of yours. They boil down to, if I understand you correctly, you're not willing to consider the truth claims of the Catholic Church because of the behavior of Catholics. That's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
And you have been hurt by the behavior of Catholics, and you've been scandalized by the behavior of Catholics. And I don't know the particulars of your mother's case, but I feel pretty safe in saying that you were badly treated. And perhaps your mother was badly treated. I don't know the circumstances, but I mean, in principle, excommunication is a discipline that Jesus instituted. Whether it was applied rightly or wrongly, I'll just assume for the sake of argument that it was badly applied, that it was an injustice in this particular case, and so your family was not well served and they were treated unjustly. I'll just assume that for the sake of this discussion. And so I'm sympathetic. And clearly, I think the number one reason, if someone were to ask me, like, could you ever come up with a good reason not to be Catholic? Well, not really. But if I had to come up with one, I'd say, like, Catholics behaving badly is the worst scandal that anyone would have to overcome.
I agree.
Right? All I can tell you is, while there are bad Catholics, there are saintly Catholics. There are saintly Catholics. And the Church has never promised that being Catholic will automatically make you saintly. What the Church teaches is that the teaching and the sacraments of the Catholic faith provide the resources, if you will, to become a saint. But to actually become a saint, you got to want to get on board. St. Peter says in his epistle that in the promises of Christ we have all we need for life and godliness. But he doesn't promise that we'll actually realize life and godliness. Mm-hmm. In fact, he warns. He says it's possible to come to the knowledge of the truth and then fall back, and then your condition is even worse. Yeah. All right. So Jesus had the same problem. He had apostles to whom he gave everything they needed for life and godliness. But one of them ended very, very, very badly, and I'm sure scandalized many. So, I would invite you to consider the witness of Catholics that have been faithful to the truth and the resources that are there for life and godliness. And I'm sorry on behalf of the Church for those Catholics that treated you badly.
Tim, thank you again for your call, and we will keep you on our prayers. Here's right now Jeff listening in Cleveland right now on AM 1260, The Rock. Hey there, Jeff. What's on your mind today?
Hey, good afternoon. Very quickly, a Catholic, who calls himself a cafeteria Catholic. They agree or support abortion or gay marriage, although they're not involved with one and they haven't counseled someone into getting an abortion. Sitting around the table, they'll defend those type of concepts. Is that a sin needed to be confessed? Is it a mortal sin? Please talk about that.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. The book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 32, speaks about God's righteous decree against those who approve of evil. All right? And it is a sin to formally cooperate with evil. To will the evil end is wrong. Is wrong. In the book of Genesis, chapter 6, God sent the flood because of what men were thinking. That's what the text says.
Wow.
Right? Because the thoughts of their hearts were wholly evil. And, our relationship with God does not end at our interior life. I mean, it continues into our physical actions, but it begins in our interior life.
Every time.
Right? And the interior life is that one thing necessary that Christ talks about in the Gospel of Luke. So for us to positively will evil is wrong, and potentially could be gravely wrong or mortally sinful.
Okay. Jeff, thank you so much for your call. Here's a quick email from Sabrina. She says, I've been taking my Baptist husband to Mass on the condition that we go to a service at his church. So could you please lay out a timeline of their development on theology, on eternal security? And what would be the best Catholic response for once saved, always saved?
Yeah, thanks. Got about a minute to do this. I'll do my best.
You can do it.
So the Baptist Church came into existence in 1609 and it piggybacked really on the Protestant Reformation. And the key doctrine of the Protestant Reformation was this position called justification by faith alone, that God would account me just, would consider me to be just simply on the basis of my faith for the sake of Christ, and not because of any behavior that I've engaged in, not because of any kind of renovation of my moral life. Well, particularly in the Calvinist tradition, the logical entailment of that was that, well, if I'm accounted just by faith alone, and my moral behavior is not going to separate me from God, as long as I got faith, I'm good to go, right? I'm not going to lose it. Now, Luther actually thought you could lose the faith. Calvin thought once you had the gift of faith, you were never going to lose it. So if you were justified by faith alone, and morality is not going to separate you from God, and you're never going to lose your faith if you have real faith, well, then you're eternally secure. And so, the movement from justification by faith alone to the Baptist position, once saved, always saved, is a little bit of a transition, right? But it's pretty close to the origins of that Reformation theology. How do you respond to that? Well, a very easy way is to just simply show all the Scripture passages that indicate we can, in fact, fall out of the state of grace through bad moral behavior. There are many of them. 2 Peter chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 6, Galatians chapter 5, Matthew chapter 25. I mean, you just go through the Bible and just pick them out. Those judgment passages where Christ says we'll be judged according to our works, like Romans chapter 2 or Revelation chapter 20. The Bible's just chock full of stuff saying how you act matters. You're not justified by faith alone, James says, chapter 2 of his epistle. What you do matters.
Absolutely. Sabrina, thank you so much for your email. Fast moving hour. Dr. David Anders, thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Tom.
We do the program right here on EWTN Radio Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern and a best of show on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of Charles, Ryan, and Jeff, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. See you next time. God bless.